College football nerds doing another preview for y'all. This time it's Notre Dame. Had plenty of people asking about it, so we're happy to talk about it. Obviously got Josh, my co-host, in here riding shotgun. We're going to get nerdy with y'all. We're going to talk Notre Dame football. But before we do that, I want to remind y'all, please subscribe, give us a like, do all that great stuff. But most importantly, because most of you are already subscribed because you love us that much, most importantly, let us know in the comments what you think Notre Dame's going to do this season. And even if you think we're dead wrong, tell us why. We're happy to talk to you about it. All right, Josh, let's get right into this. Notre Dame 2019. I want to start off with what you love. Sometimes we catch some flack from Notre Dame because we're so analytical, and they have become this kind of, they've been up there among the elite programs, and we are very tough on elite programs. We judge them with a microscope, and we really kind of beat them up sometimes, and it comes off a little negative. So I want to kick this one out of the gate with a little positive love to Notre Dame because they deserve it. After the year they had last year, they earned it. So tell me, 2019 Notre Dame, what's got you feeling good about this team?
I think the biggest thing to me for Notre Dame is the fact that they return Aquara and Kareem. I mean, you've got two guys that both had 10-plus tackles for loss and one of the more disruptive front sevens in college football last season. I think that was something that was a big contributor to them staying to a certain degree in the game with Clemson until late. I think it was a major edge they had over Alabama, frankly. And when you compare the two games and why, as much as Notre Dame maybe struggled in other areas, they probably were a lot more successful in some ways on defense up until the injury. So I think tackles for loss, I think disruptiveness on defense. Obviously, you got to look at Ian Book as returning as a starter. You got to look at 4 offensive linemen coming back. There's a lot of reasons to be positive, but to me, it starts with their ability to disrupt the passer and to create disruption in the run game, create negative plays, and get opposing teams off schedule, not even just with the starters, but with probably 3 deep at that position.
And, last year we were, I think, reasonably critical of Notre Dame when you look at their close games against bad teams, and that's one of the things that we say is a canary in the coal mine, is that when you play poorly against bad teams consistently, even in wins, you should be judged by it if you are trying to say you're an elite playoff type team. But I think the flip side of that is also true, in that last year, the score of that Clemson game, in my opinion, was not at all indicative of how well Notre Dame played, especially in that first half. I think they were actually deep enough, senior laden enough that the stage wasn't too big for them, maybe like it was a little bit against Alabama a few years earlier. I don't think they're getting enough credit for the team that they had in that game before Julian Love got hurt, enough credit for the team they fielded and that they really did belong in that game. But Julian Love got hurt, and then things went sideways. What did you draw from that?
Well, this is where we have to be a little bit negative, right? I mean, the concern is when Julian Love got hurt, they suddenly got exposed in the secondary. Now, Alabama had the same thing happen to them. They were short their number one corner, as they were for the second half of the season. And they, I think I saw the statistic recently that Clemson in that game, it was like they passed for 60 or 70 yards on the left side of the field, 60, 70 in the middle, and it was like 280 yards on the right side of the field. I mean, they picked on both teams. But I think the difference between Notre Dame and Alabama in that example is the guy that got picked on from Alabama is coming back, or at least the guy that got injured that caused him to be picked on, right? Notre Dame isn't getting Julian Love back. And the concern, again, Aquara and Kareem would be number 1 and number 2 in the team in tackles for loss. But number 3 was Tillery. Number 4 was Coney. Number 5 was Tranquil. And then it was Hayes and Agundiji. I'm probably butchering that name, and I apologize. But but the point here is everybody with over 3 tackles for loss, the only 2 guys coming back were Aquara and Kareem. It's just a lot of missed production. And I think the offense was good. They put up a lot of points, consistently putting up really 30 or more, other than that one really sort of sleepy game against Pittsburgh. And again, they had a bad half really against Northwestern and came back in that one. But I do feel a little bit of concern in that the guys they lost defensively were so key to that unit. And when we saw just one guy go out in the Clemson game, it felt like it had a domino effect for the entire rest of the team. I don't know what they're going to look like next season. You know, we're not beat writers. It's hard for us to project at that level because we don't watch practice. But it does give me some pause when I see not just production, but I have production and I have an example where last season, when they didn't have one of those players, they really struggled.
Yeah, and I also don't love that they lost Dexter Williams, who I was really high on all year last year. And, you know, we saw in the first few games where there was no Ian Book that they struggled on offense, and you want to give the incumbent guy a chance to hold on to a spot. I get that. We did see the offense pick up. But we caught a lot of heat last year in our preview of the Notre Dame Clemson game in that we said that we're going to find out who Ian Book is, because there haven't been that many opportunities to see him against elite defenses. And I think some of that proved out in what we were saying, in that we didn't think he was the elite quarterback that maybe Notre Dame fans thought he was. That doesn't mean he's a bad quarterback, and that doesn't mean he won't improve this year and maybe improve into that elite quarterback. But if you look at the 4 quarterbacks in the playoffs last year, you know, you've got a Heisman winner, a guy that probably would have won the Heisman in any other season, and this year's Heisman front runner, Trevor Lawrence. So you got Tua, Lawrence, and Kyler Murray. And then the fourth in my mind doesn't look like the other 3 in terms of being that good on an elite level. So my concern is, if you're Notre Dame and you know you have some talent deficiencies here or there but are pretty good in the aggregate, the one thing that can equalize talent deficiencies is having an elite quarterback. The concern for me is if they get back into the playoffs, there might be at a talent deficiency overall and not have as good a quarterback. In your mind, looking up and down to this schedule, do you think it'll be a little different where we won't be playing the guessing game on Ian Book and we'll know what we got before we get to the playoffs?
I think we probably will. I think one of the things that made last year most difficult was the fact that the Michigan game, was week 1. And I know they won that game, but we really didn't know what Book was, because without the Michigan game being on the book list, the rest of the season they had some really good games, but frankly against teams that were really struggling last year. And it's not Notre Dame's fault, and we say this all the time when we talk strength of schedule. The only thing you can do as a school is to schedule big names. But, you know, unexpectedly, Florida State was awful. USC, terrible. Virginia Tech, not very good. Stanford, down year. So it just made it really hard to judge where Ian Book was as a passer. I think this year we're probably not going to have that problem. I mean, you get Georgia in week 3. I think Georgia's obviously going to be a really high watermark. Probably another massive game again. Probably setting records yet again. I think I've already heard that Georgia Notre Dame game is the most expensive ticket on StubHub today. Virginia, Michigan's got a great defense. So you're going to have about 3 games, and interestingly, I think probably in a not ideal sense, 3 games. Well, not quite in a 4-week span, right? Because you have the open date between USC and Michigan, but 3 games out of 5 weeks against pretty good defenses, and we'll have a pretty good idea pretty quick with Book. I'll throw one point back at you, though, which is interesting. How many people realize that Ian Book had a higher yard per attempt average last year than Trevor Lawrence? I mean, Ian Book was 15th in the country at 8.4 yards per attempt. Trevor Lawrence was 19th in the country at 8.3 yards per attempt. I mean, their QB ratings, 153.96 for Book, 157.56 for Lawrence. I don't think quite enough credit is given either. I'm not sure which way you want to go. The fact that Book statistically was competitive with Lawrence, or maybe that, on the other hand, Lawrence was only 19th in the country and didn't actually measure up, especially when you looked at Murray and Tonga Vailoa, that both set records at 11-plus yards per attempt as a season average.
Well, and I think it was pretty evident that he was a difference maker for that team when we saw the offense and how it changed. You know, we say we didn't get to see him against teams like Michigan, but we also got to see Notre Dame with Wimbush against Ball State. I think that game was like 28-20 or something like that, and it was just really poor offensively. They weren't great against Vanderbilt offensively. So we saw them do the thing we wanted them to do earlier in the year, in that they crushed a lot of good teams offensively. And yeah, he had a little bit of a struggle game against Northwestern, but Northwestern was good last year. I mean, if they had an offense, I think they give Ohio State everything they wanted. So I also think on the schedule this year, it's not just Georgia, Virginia, who's not got a great offense but has a good defense, Michigan, Navy's good, Virginia Tech I think will be better. Bud Foster's last year, I think they're going to play for him. Boston College was a good defensive team last year, and I think Stanford will bounce back. So not only do we have more opportunities to see Ian Book, but also we have opportunities to see at least collectively as a sum, we see a schedule that is actually might turn out to be a lot tougher than a lot of the same teams last year, might even be tough enough that they could have a loss on this schedule and still make the playoffs. What do you think?
I think it's entirely possible. Again, when we talk playoff scenarios, it's never in a vacuum. Every year is totally dependent upon what everybody else does in a given year. That's sort of a weird harping point on us when people like to point to one season and go, well, they got in that year. Why can't we get in this year? It's like, well, the teams around you, somebody went undefeated this year. They didn't go undefeated that year. But when you look at 2019 Notre Dame, there should be some pretty good teams on this list. I mean, hopefully USC rebounds for their sake. If not, then they're going to be coach shopping pretty quick. Georgia, having them back on the schedule, I think is huge, especially with Michigan being a top 10 team as well. 2 top 10 matchups is going to be a pretty big deal, more than likely, at least when those teams play at the very least. But the rest of the schedule, as you alluded to, I think could be a little sneakily more difficult. Stanford is almost certainly going to rebound. Boston College has not been bad, though they've lost their star running back. You never know quite what you're going to get with them, partly due to the recruiting not being high enough to maintain consistency. But the rest of it, Virginia's expected to be one of the better teams in the ACC, at least in that division. I don't think Louisville is going to necessarily be a challenge in week 1, given what we saw out of them last year. But it's a schedule that I think can afford them a loss, because if you have one loss, you're probably going to have at least one top 10 win. And if you've got a top 10 win and a top 10 loss, let's say they go 11-1, I think the playoff is very much on the table. Now, personally, I think 10-2 is more likely a scenario, but 11-1, I think 11-1 Notre Dame maybe does get in. And I'll throw one thing back to you, though, and that's kind of off topic, but I think one of the biggest things with this team, and everybody talks about it, is their ability to replace production with Miles Boykin at receiver. And if Notre Dame, let's say they take a step back because of that, and they lose their deep playability, how much do you think it would affect Notre Dame going into this year if Notre Dame doesn't have the ability to have an explosive offense in a game or runaway points? Is there anybody on their schedule that, to you, really scares you because they might end up in a shootout, and without Boykin, maybe, let's say theoretically, without Boykin on the roster, they're not able to keep pace?
So I think it's kind of in their favor, and it is an interesting question given their schedule. I think it's in their favor because I don't think that there's a lot of runaway offensive, production days that they're going to see against them. Because I still think even with all the losses, they're going to have a good secondary. They've actually got a lot of production coming back in the secondary. And as much as we want to talk about the Julian Love thing, it's not fair to compare a guy going down in the middle of the game to having his replacement come back over the course of, a season where we've got a spring camp and a fall camp and a few games of experience. It's a whole lot different than replacing a guy in the moment and seeing that production drop off. They're going to have a great pass rush. I don't think they're going to have a lot of shootouts. I'm not high on Michigan's offense anyway. I think Gaddis is a guy that's never called plays, and he's coming in. Harbaugh's still going to have his hand in the cookie jar. I think Michigan might do another 17-point type game against Notre Dame. Georgia could score a lot of points, but last time Georgia played them, they didn't score a lot of points. And Notre Dame is physical enough, I think, to match Georgia there. So, and on the flip side, they've got one of the best offensive coordinators in the game. So, Yes, they might lose some production there. I'm actually more concerned about losing production at running back than I am at any receiver position, because if you don't have that security blanket of running back that can get you 3 or 4 yards when you need it, not necessarily on first down, as we talked about earlier this week, that's where my big concern is. If they don't have a powerful running game, I think Ian Book is good enough, and that offense is creative enough to manufacture points in big games. But if they don't have the running game to complement him or make him be the complement to a running game, they're not going to score enough points to beat Georgia, because they will need to score 20 plus to beat Georgia. And if they don't have a running game against Georgia, they're not going to do it.
And we talked about this a little bit with the Georgia season preview we did, and I don't want to steal the thunder from a game preview that we're almost certainly going to be doing in week 3. But Georgia's prospective weakness this season is the front seven is retooling quite a bit, and they struggled against the run last year. We've already heard some rumblings out of Georgia's camp that they're not super confident that the front is really, lack for a better term, SEC quality, right? I mean, they're not necessarily monsters in the front 4 or front 7. So I think you're probably right. The bigger deal with that Georgia game looming early is probably going to be their ability to run the ball, not the ability to pass the ball for Notre Dame, because Georgia's secondary should be pretty good still. But again, regardless, I mean, they can probably drop that Georgia game and be in decent shape. But maybe that's sort of the last point. We assume 11-1 on its face gets Georgia in the playoff. But if you take that a step further, we've been putting forth this hypo on a couple things. It's interesting that the SEC is going to play Auburn playing Oregon, LSU playing Texas, and Georgia playing Notre Dame. How much could the Georgia loss really hurt them more than a typical one loss to an elite team? Do you think it's a lot more significant because you have the possibility, let's say, that Georgia goes 12-0 in the SEC, and then Alabama beats Georgia in the SEC championship game? Does that mean that the one loss is maybe a lot worse, and in my view maybe it is, than it looks on face value, because then you end up with a Notre Dame that's at 11-1 but did not play in a conference championship game being compared to a Georgia that's 12-1 whose only loss was in a conference championship game? Do you think they end up being left out or hurt, in this case really because of their lack of conference affiliation, and potentially not only being leapfrogged by other conferences, but one loss, let's say an LSU or an Auburn or a Georgia that actually beat maybe a conference champion in another conference?
So it's an interesting question, and just to kind of sanitize that, if Notre Dame loses to Georgia and Georgia runs the table and loses to Alabama, does it hurt Notre Dame? This is the one place where I think where it would hurt in Oregon, like if Oregon loses to Auburn or Texas loses to LSU, you almost like strike them off if either of those teams go 11-1, because they would be the next one up. This is where Notre Dame's really diverse schedule kind of helps them, because they get to have these data points facing other conferences. They get to have these data points against the Michigan, who might win the Big Ten, which that's the big one. So for Notre Dame, if you lose to Georgia in week 3, or if you win to Georgia, either way, it's a big game, but it's bigger if you win than if you lose, because you can take the slot from the Big Ten if you beat Michigan and pray they beat Ohio State. So that's to me, that's where Notre Dame's kind of super diverse schedule, because you've got 2 Pac-12 teams on the table, so you have those data points. Like, let's say Oregon struggles with Stanford, loses to USC or something, still wins the Pac-12, and Notre Dame smokes both these teams. Man, I mean, that's what we want, right? We want all of these data points that cross over, so that when you have a loss somewhere down the line, you have other things to point to. So I guess this kind of rolls us into winding this down and picking their season, because we're kind of doing it already. So why don't you wait? Let me give you mine, and I'll let you finish this off. We'll kind of flip it up a little bit. I've got them going 10-2 this year. I think that they will not take a big step back in terms of overall team quality, in terms of either offensive or defensive side of the ball. I think Brian Kelly's still going to field a good team regardless. I think they're going to be about as good as they were last year, but I think their schedule in aggregate is going to be a good bit harder than it was last year, and it's going to end up biting them in the butt down the line. I got to go on 10-2.
Yeah, I kind of have them as a 10-2 team as well, and it really boils down to the fact, like you said, they may not take a big step back from last year's team that made the playoffs, right? Big deal. I kind of feel like somehow we all look down on Notre Dame because they lost to a Clemson team that, by the way, also beat the heck out of Alabama. But as you put it, the schedule's pretty tough. And it's easy for us to stand up here and say, oh, they're going to lose to Georgia and they're going to lose to Michigan. I don't think necessarily that's so set in stone. The problem is, let's say they're 60% likely to lose to Georgia and 60% likely to lose to Michigan. They're also probably 85% likely to win the rest of their games because a lot of them are losable. And if you want to talk odds, if you have you play 7 teams and you're 85% likely to beat all of them, you got about a 70-80% chance of losing at least one of that set, even though you're 85% chance in each individual game. And that's what Notre Dame faces a lot more this year, I think, than last year. Again, we kind of were critical about the fact like we didn't think Syracuse really belonged where they were as a hype team at the end of the season. We thought their schedule was a little weaker. I don't have that same critique this year. I think the teams in their schedule should be harder. And then, as you said, that Michigan game and the Georgia game are linchpins for their respective conferences, and I think that's a really huge boon for Notre Dame. Because if they lose those games, it's going to be forgivable, at least one of them. And if they win them, it's going to be huge. So it's going to be interesting to sort of see, how that shakes out. I will say this. If they beat Georgia in week 3, do you think they're almost in the playoff by default? Because at that point, maybe they lose to Michigan, but, they maybe don't get it over the SEC champ or Clemson. But I think they got a pretty good shot over getting over at least one or two of the other conference champions if they're 11-1 with a win over Georgia, even if they lose to Michigan.
So my 10-2, I actually don't think, I'm not automatically assuming they lose to Georgia and Michigan and that's their 2. I actually think they win one of those games, which to me means that I really think that just the collective of their schedule is going to get to them at some point, which means they might beat a Georgia but lose to Virginia Tech. And I don't think that you can afford – I think you can afford a loss to Michigan or Georgia, but then you got to run the table, which is kind of what we're already saying. But I think that – I really think that they get a win with Georgia or Michigan and lose to a Virginia Tech or a Boston College or somebody like that. And I know that's not exactly what you asked me. I still don't think they're a lock because at that point we're so far off in theoretical without knowing the other side of it, which is what you open with in terms of knowing what everybody else does, that it's almost impossible to say. But I think that they'd be right up there because this schedule this year is I think is going to be better than it has been in the past. All right, Josh, I think that's it for us on our Notre Dame preview. Thanks, y'all, for hanging out this long. I want to remind you again in the comments, let us know what you think Notre Dame is going to do this year. We think they're going to do pretty well, maybe take a little step back. But, hey, you Notre Dame fans can let us know how we're wrong and why we're wrong in the data. And, thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week. Remember to subscribe, and God bless.